Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Leaders, the podcast that explains global events through discussions with women experts. And welcome to ELN, the European Leadership Network, the home of this podcast. I'm Ilana Beit-El. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow at ELN, and I'm your host for this conversation with women who are leading and shaping the world in many ways and fields. We're recording on Thursday, 8th of January, so there's definitely time to wish everyone a Happy New Year. Clearly one that started with a bigger show than usual, especially in Latin America, and to wish us all as well in this first episode of our 6th year of the podcast. So, as noted, the year started with a bang, or a snatch and grab by the US in Venezuela. 150 drones and aircraft, quite a lot of soldiers, and an abducted president and his wife now in the US. Nobody's going to cry for Maduro, but nonetheless, this was quite an interesting event, explained even more interestingly by President Trump and his fellow associates. We don't really know what's going on, but nonetheless, to try and understand better what's going on and to look ahead at this very confusing year, we have with us, I'm delighted to say, Rachel Ellehuus, who's the Director General of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute in the UK, one of the oldest and most important think tanks in the world that deal with matters of defence and security. Hi, Rachel. Lovely to see you, and thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
As ever, could you tell us a bit about yourself before we move into events of the day?
Absolutely. So as you indicated, I'm based here in London. I'm the Director General of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, and I've been in the position almost a year to the day, actually. My previous position was actually in Brussels at US NATO, the US mission to NATO at NATO headquarters in Brussels, where I was the Defense Advisor and the Secretary of Defense's senior representative there. I started that job in February of 2022, just a few days before the renewed invasion of Ukraine. So an exciting trajectory, even just in the last few years.
And prior to that?
Prior to that, a long career in the Pentagon, but also some time in the think tank world in Washington, D.C. At the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. And then earlier, a lot of experience, frankly, in Europe. I spent a year in the UK Ministry of Defence working on their strategic defence review over a decade ago, and then worked in the think tank world in the Czech Republic and in Denmark as well. So like to think I understand a bit about both perspectives on both sides of the Atlantic.
Well, it sounds like you're incredibly well qualified to do that. Of that, there is absolutely no doubt, and we're going to enjoy the conversation about it. But for those uninitiated, can you explain what US NATO and what the Defense Advisor and why the Secretary of Defense needs a senior representative at NATO?
Sure. So I think most of your listeners are probably familiar with NATO, and now going strong with the addition of Sweden and Finland as members. So within NATO, you'd have the Secretary General's office. So Mark Rutte would have a small front office staff, and then he would have a number of assistant secretaries general that would help him in different areas. Let's say nuclear policy or defense policy planning or cyber and emerging technology. But in addition to that, every member of the alliance would have its own delegation, almost like a bit of an embassy inside of NATO headquarters. And that would then be made up of people who were sent forward from their capitals, from either the State Department, the US military, or the Department of Defense, in order to translate what was going on at NATO headquarters and in those discussions back to capitals, and then conversely to bring in the US position into the NATO conversations and to try to move things forward by going back and forth in that regard. So the Defense Advisor is one of only two politically appointed jobs in the US to NATO. The other one is the U.S. ambassador. And so the U.S. ambassador is, of course, or permanent representative to NATO, as they're more formally called, is in charge of the entire mission. And then my role as the defense advisor and the Secretary of Defense's representative would be to look after the office of the defense advisor. So all the kind of military and more sort of Office of the Secretary of Defense, Pentagon type equity. So that would include things like defense industrial policy, defense planning, actually intelligence cooperation as well. All of those things would fall under the purview of the defense advisor. And the reason for the additional title of the Secretary of Defense representative in Europe is because, at least as of this moment, the bulk of the forces and capabilities making up NATO's deterrence and defense capability are US. So think about all the forces that are based at European Command and all those component commands around Europe, whether that's in Brunsum or Naples or out at Shape, or at Markham here in the UK. There are a lot of US forces in Europe and making up the backbone of NATO. So the idea is that US NATO uniquely has to have a direct line to the Secretary of Defense to manage all of those forces and capabilities in a way that reflects US as well as NATO interests.
Well, thank you. I think that's an excellent explanation because whilst I myself am au fait with the way NATO is structured, for most people looking on the outside, it's extremely difficult to explain how NATO works when it does work. We will come back to NATO and you will comment that it's going strong, but we have to start with Venezuela. What do you think happened there?
I think we're still trying to make sense of that, actually. If I look back all the way to October, our researchers at RUSI were sort of predicting that something was building. We saw the interdictions of some of the small boats and vessels. We saw a lot of messaging and posturing to try to paint Venezuela as a narco state that had to be dealt with. We saw the release of the US National Defense Strategy, which had a strong focus on the Western Hemisphere and the role of the Western Hemisphere and South and Latin America in particular to US national security. So in a way, you could kind of see the strategy leading to the invasion of Venezuela, the explosions, and then the removal of Maduro. But what's sort of curious about it is what is the intent? Because if you look at the facts, there are other countries in the region that probably could also have the label of narco state, maybe even more so than Venezuela. It's, I think, quite a few people, particularly in the Venezuelan diaspora around the world, were very hopeful that this was a sort of regime change that would lead to the institution of the opposition leader, who many believe was democratically elected. When Maduro sort of stole the election. That also doesn't seem to be the case so far. As far as we can tell, we're still trying to figure out what was the legal justification and what is the follow-up plan for this. The other thing I'd observe about the Venezuela operation is that it was not really carried out primarily by US military forces. The bulk of the assets were law enforcement, FBI and DIA. So I think we have to think carefully about what that means for being involved in international operations when it's not something that's coming out of the Pentagon or the State Department. Is that setting a new and dangerous precedent for US intervention overseas, and in particular, the proposed application of US law outside of its own territory?
DIA, just to be clear, is?
DEA, sorry, it's the Drug Enforcement Agency.
Right. Though I believe that those who at least actually made the breakthrough were military, and they were immediately followed on by these other law enforcement representatives, and a lot of them too. But let's take one step back and carry on in what you're saying, simply in the sense that this is very dangerous, not just in the sense that we are talking about, is this a dangerous precedent for law enforcement to go in like this, but also just both are signatories, both the US and Venezuela, whether we like it or not, are signatories to the United Nations Charter. Both of them apparently abide by international law. And if there's something basic about international law is you don't just go into another country unless you've declared war on it. Nobody has declared war, as far as I know. In fact, the last time the US actually declared war, I looked this up, was in the Second World War. It's never declared war since, including in Vietnam, including in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere like that. But nonetheless, you are going in, you're violating the sovereignty of another state for very spurious reasons. Nobody is apparently, I mean, nobody is particularly sorry for Maduro or thinks that he's a nice guy. But if we went on that basis, then I'm not sure there would be any leaders left in the world. Where does that leave us, really?
Well, it wouldn't be the first time that the United States has, moved ahead of the precedent of international law and or moved on a shaky legal ground or moved out without the express permission of Congress. What I think is a bit different here is that there doesn't seem to be any of the normal coordination that would have been in place. So I didn't really see a lot of coordination within the U.S. government, either through the National Security Council. I didn't see a consolidated buildup between the Pentagon, the State Department, and the armed forces. It almost seemed like this was planned out of area in Southcom among a small group of people. And that's a little bit worrying because I think, as you know and your listeners know, it's not just about that first military operation. That's in many ways the easy part. You have very concrete objectives, very limited objectives. It's the what comes next. It's the nation building. It's the security and the viability of the state. It's the security of the citizens. And none of those things seems to have been thought through. So I think we're only seeing the beginning of the chaos there, and whether that instability in Venezuela will persist and whether it could potentially spread throughout the region is something we have to work out. There are open questions now about whether the Trump administration has designs on other countries in the region. A lot of people speculating around Cuba in particular.
Do you think he would go for somewhere like Mexico? I mean, if you're serious about drugs, then Mexico presumably is the place that you would go to first, wouldn't you?
Well, that would be rather ambitious given just the size of Mexico and its proximity to the US border. So, in all of these things, I understand in many ways the motivation and the desire to get at a problem like Venezuela that has been not just a burden to Venezuelan citizens in the country and the diaspora around the world, but to the whole region. You speak to people from Chile, Argentina, Peru, Colombia. Venezuela is a state that is exporting instability. It has even interfered, one could say, in politics in Europe, in Spain, for example, trying to influence left-wing parties there. So in terms of sympathy for Maduro or Venezuela as an existing state, there isn't much of that around. But you're right to ask those questions around respect for rules and norms that have guided us for decades, if not.
It's especially so because, and I think a lot of people don't realize this, thinking about what we now know as the international order actually starts in the mid-19th century, and it starts both in Europe and in the US, and comes to its, for want of a better way of putting it, its first fruition during and after the First World War. Wilson's 14 points and most of the ideas about how to create an order in which you have independent states and you have arbitration start before the war, especially with the Hague Conventions and with the International Court that was built there. But as we know, it then, due to its failure after the First War, it is recreated for the Second War, but very much led by the US, both in the first instance during the First World War and after, and in the second instance. To me, when I look at what's going on now in the US and with the US, it's as though it's not just that we don't want the international order, we don't even want to lead the international order. And that's nearly baffling, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a real sea change. I started my career in the Pentagon when Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense under the Bush administration. And so I've seen a lot of change in security and defense policy, but there has always been this core belief among Democrats and Republicans, wherever they were on the spectrum, that it was in the United States' interest to have a network of allies and partners around the world who they would cooperate with and work with to further and advance US interests, but also to further collective interests. So I think what we're hearing now and seeing now in practice is the United States saying, not only do we not want to be the guardian and the enforcer of that international rules-based system, we are willing and prepared to act unilaterally in pursuit of our own interests, rather than to subsume those to the collective good. And that's, that's a harsh reality. It's an extreme version of realism and self-interest. It's not as if it's never been seen in the history of the US, but particularly in the time frame that you painted since the end of the Second World War, that was the grand bargain. Essentially, allies and partners were the US sphere of influence. And I think we'll wake up a bit too late when we realize that sphere of influence that has bolstered US power, trust, credibility, and frankly, economic might and business interests is gone.
I think it's crashed. That's, I think, what so many people find odd, because it's not as though it's just moved, it's crashed in, sort of, yes, it was declining, it was moving, you could look at a lot of different, whether it's Bush to, George W. and, adventures in Afghanistan and Iraq, whether it was, frankly, Obama moving back from the red line in Syria, which allows Russia into the Middle East very, very desperately. The JCPOA, which was a good idea, but wasn't followed up properly in the way it probably should have been followed up. Trump 1, Trump 2. It's been declining, but
Yes.
It's crashed suddenly now.
Yeah. Well, it has been declining, and it's been declining not just because of the US. I mean, if we're being fair, rules, what were once rules have become norms, and what were norms have disappeared entirely. We've seen a number of countries, Russia, China, Iran, you name it, signing up for treaties and agreements and then just trampling all over them. We see civilians being targeted in war scenarios. Those are all things that are off the table, were off the table for so long and taboo for so long. So it's not just the US that's eroding those rules and norms. But again, I think some people would say, particularly in the current administration in the US, that system was not working for a good portion of the world. It wasn't working for the US. And there is an element of truth in that. If we look at the UN Security Council, it really doesn't reflect some of the power centers of the world. I mean, where is India? Where is Brazil? So they would argue that it's probably ripe for disruption and change. My problem is that after the disruption and the crash, where's the rebuild?
Yes, but where I would maybe not dispute you, I would add to what you're saying before we even get to the rebuild. The decline has been for some years, as you say. And the US reaction, if you were the leader, if you were the top dog, why were you ignoring all of this? I mean, when it came to the Security Council, the US never, under any administration, was really willing to entertain proper reform of the Security Council. Instead of taking the leadership on it and saying, no, this is what we should be doing. It was never. So if we take ourselves back, is this sort of a certain triumphalism after the end of the Cold War? We won, so we're now top dog and we can do what we want, until one day we wake up and find out that actually we can't and we don't want to.
Triumphalism, but also, wanting to stay top dog, wanting to continue to make the rules and set the boundaries, and maybe a little bit of hubris and arrogance, thinking that Western nations know better than others in the world. In the last year, I've spent quite a bit of time in the Middle East and went to the Doha Forum, spent some time in Dubai, and I'm just so impressed with the level of dynamism and innovation there. And I think we're doing ourselves a disservice if we always think that traditional cabal of Western nations are the ones that have all the answers.
Oh, absolutely. And not just that, I think that your word on dynamism is hugely important. One of the things that always strikes me when I go out of Europe is that whether it's the Middle East, whether parts of Africa, whether Latin America, India, um, I'm giving all of these examples, Brazil, where I was also very lately, a sort of sense of push and interest in, no, there's not a huge amount of money there, but everybody wants to try and make money and evolve and do things and find things. And you just don't feel that in the West anymore. It's not something that you sort of is tangible. Everybody's worried about their pension and their health insurance in one way or another. And that for sure is true. But coming back to the US, so what does the US now make of Africa, Asia, Russia for sure, but that's part of Asia, Eurasia, and Europe? Just not interested or what?
Well, I mean, it's a big question, and it's hard to know because probably one of the only indications that we have right now is the National Defense Strategy, which does seem to prioritize in the first instance homeland security and defense, and then the immediate periphery of the U.S., which is how you get the focus on the Western Hemisphere. But I wonder though whether there is a sense that doesn't necessarily come out in the National Defense Strategy or the daily press stories, where the U.S. really does still see China as the pacing challenge, and there really is a sense that Russia is a challenge, if not a threat. Just today we're reading the stories about U.S. tankers off the coast of the U.K. assisting with boarding some of the shadow vessels that are purported to be smuggling Venezuelan oil under a Russian flag. So I think it's easy to say that the U.S. is isolationist, or it's doubling down on its own region, but to be a little bit fair here, I think when you look at the laydown of forces, the exercises, the investment, particularly in the National Defense Authorization Act, the US is still very active globally, particularly in Indo-Pacific and even in Europe on certain discrete issues that are of international and transnational interest. Africa, frankly, has always suffered in U.S. interests. I remember when they combined European Command and Africa Command. I thought that did a disservice to both theaters. And the cuts in development aid are certainly quite naive, both in the US and the UK, in terms of that dynamism and that potential in Africa, but also some of the conflict and resource challenges that constrain that growth and that dynamism. So I worry about the lack of interest in Africa on behalf of the US. And then as far as the Middle East, you have seen a lot of action there. It's not an easy place to characterize in a collective term, but in many ways, it's an easier game for the U.S., particularly to work with the Gulf states, because they can do that on a more mercantilist transactional basis. Trump has hit a wall a bit in terms of the Israel-Gaza conflict. Once again, coming in, signing an agreement on paper, but where's the implementation? Where's the rebuild? That's the part that I'm missing. Whether it's a perspective deal on Ukraine, whatever we're looking at in Venezuela, or in the Middle East in the Israel-Gaza conflict.
Let's just talk Ukraine a second before we can also talk Gaza in a minute. But Ukraine has gone silent. It's as though nobody really knows what's happening, but equally nobody knows what to do. What do you think is the US perspective on that? Because there was a loss of interest to a certain extent, to be fair, also during the Biden administration, or too cautious an approach, maybe. But now there's no approach really, other than you must do this and then walking it back.
Well, from where I sit here in Whitehall, there's a lot of energy around Ukraine, primarily because I feel as if the United Kingdom has been handed the baton in terms of exhibiting leadership on Ukraine and rallying everything from political will to putting together the coalition of the willing to continuing to purchase weapons and get them into Ukraine together with a couple of other key allies. Poland, Denmark, Germany. So I think there is a lot of action, but on the battlefield, you're right, there is a bit of stagnation on both sides. The Ukrainians are still on the fight. The Russians don't seem to be backing away, but there have not been meaningful gains on either side. So it's a frustrating situation. It's frustrating that the Trump administration and Trump in particular came in a year ago saying he would solve it in days or weeks. And now, almost a year on, we really have done nothing but provide an umbrella under which President Putin can continue to bash the Ukrainians. There's been no ceasefire. There's been no meaningful peace deals that both sides could accept, put on the table. There's been very little accountability pushed or constraints pushed on the Russians. I'm missing that. I did read something today about the sanctions package going forward. Trump had green-lighted that. So perhaps that, together with the sinking oil prices in Venezuela, will create a bit of momentum for the Ukrainians.
Why do you think Putin feels he can exert so much pressure on Trump? I think this is something that baffles everyone.
Well, I think there are any number of theories. I think the simplest one is probably that big nations deal with big nations, and Putin is very good at reflecting the image that he thinks his interlocutor will react best to. Remember, he's an intelligence agent, so he's very good at these things. So I recognize there are a lot of conspiracy theories, but sometimes the right explanation is the easiest one. That Trump sees Putin as a straightforward interlocutor of a big nation in Europe, and thinks that's the easiest way to get to success.
Can I ask you something else? Because you've spent most of your career in government or public service in one way or another. Witkoff, Kushner, the two negotiators that Trump sends in each time, they're not. They've never been in the public service in their lives. They are both of them business people, deal makers, if you ask them. And what they do have going for them is that clearly they have the backing of Trump, so they have the backing of, authority, which nowadays most government interlocutors would just never get if they were out there negotiating in that way. But it's not a question so much of why did Trump send them, but what do you describe as their mode of negotiation, and what are the flaws? Because you've just pointed out that, quite correctly, they get to some kind of deal, at least in Gaza, but then nothing happens. So what is the problem with them? Why can't those two, or why can't somebody who's a deal maker be a good negotiator from your perspective?
Well, in the US, we have a very interesting system of government. You do have civil servants, but you also have political appointees, like I was when I was at NATO, who come from very different backgrounds. And so we've had lawyers, business people, real estate agents, investment bankers. There's nothing to say that they can't be successful as bankers or negotiators or special envoys. I mean, I've definitely seen that work in many cases better than us civil servants, who are burdened with, certain biases, certain methods of doing things. They come in with some pretty strong negotiating skills, able to sort of compartmentalize the issues. So it can work. I think where sometimes it falls short is understanding the bigger picture and the connections among things. When you are in a business environment, it's very transactional, it's very binary. But a situation like Israel-Gaza is, it's anything but binary, let's just to put it simply. So I think that is where it falls short, understanding that, let's say, a recognition of Russian claims on Ukrainian territory has longstanding effects for the stability of Europe, that it also has knock-on effects for how China perceives Taiwan and the countries in the South China Sea. That's the type of mentality that I think there is a learning process here. I have seen some iterative back and forth where Witkoff and others are learning from people like Marco Rubio and from the ambassadors in the countries, including the U.S. ambassador to NATO. But when you're new to this, that it's very international relations is very complex, baggage laden stuff with a lot of history and a lot of emotion, and you can't just put that beside on the wayside and pretend like it will not affect the outcome of that negotiation.
I think that's very, very true, and it's an excellent answer because they're not stupid people. Neither of them come across as, uninformed idiots, but they're coming in with a completely different approach and a completely different background, which does bring us to Gaza, Israel. In the case of Gaza, Israel, I think they were very focused on the hostages and they were very successful with that. But they also understood that the hostages, so for those of us who've forgotten, Hamas abducted, apart from murdering approximately 1,200 people, they abducted 250 people approximately. And this turned into one of the major reasons, and in the case of the Netanyahu government, excuses for continued attacks on Gaza. But it was also a major problem within Israel that you couldn't end the war until you got the hostages back. So getting the hostages back was not a stupid idea. It's just what comes afterwards. And as you say, these are very layered issues. So the same, I think, goes for Ukraine, where the background is very much also the failed Budapest Memorandum in 1994, when Ukraine gives up its nuclear weapons and nuclear capabilities as against a guarantee from Russia, the US, and the UK for its sovereignty. But then Russia invades, and the US then says, yes, but we only gave security assurances. We didn't give security guarantees, so we're not going to do anything. At which point the UK also says, well, if the US isn't going to do anything, we can't do anything either. So you can understand Ukraine saying, I'm not budging in my war until I get some guarantees to do, that this won't happen again. What are guarantees such as those? Because it's floated about all the time, but what are the guarantees you can think of?
Well, all of the guarantees in any of the scenarios that you mentioned have one thing in common, is that they have to be based on trust. You could sign any piece of paper, you could be as detailed or as simple in the articulation of those security guarantees, but if there isn't the belief and the trust underpinning it, then it's really not worth anything. And you're right to bring up the memorandum, because that is in the back of the Ukrainians' mind, that they did give up those nuclear weapons, they did have those guarantees, and look where they are now, look where they were in 2014. So I think we've got a real problem, and it doesn't help that President Trump has questioned the integrity of NATO. Article 5 has questioned the value of NATO and the willingness of NATO to come to, I think the other day was the defense of the US if something happened, when in reality, the only time that Article 5 was utilized was in support of the US after 9/11. So I think we've got a bigger problem here that won't be solved by a piece of paper or any sort of agreement, and it's trust and credibility of the US. So if I were Ukraine, I would be looking for a real, in addition to the piece of paper in the agreement, I would be looking for boots on the ground. I would be looking for I would be looking for the involvement of the American public and the Congress. I would be looking for language on specific tripwires and what happens if Russia crosses a very specific geographic boundary or any number of conditions. Be very specific, whether it's economic or military consequences, and make sure that that there's the funding and there's the political will to institute those consequences. You mentioned Obama's red line. I mean, nobody should set a red line that they're not willing to enforce, because then the line just moves.
Just as an aside on that, and I know our time is running out, but just as an aside on that, um, what are the unique US capabilities that it makes it so important that the US be part of the security guarantees?
Well, the U.S. is, both in a NATO context and in the context of assistance to Ukraine, is an integrator, right? As the largest member of NATO and the bringer of all of these capabilities, we're really good at providing things like a common air picture, command and control, intelligence, situational awareness. So what you saw, within the last year when the Pentagon cut off Starlink, that was very disruptive to Ukraine, because it is the backbone that integrates the fires, the situational awareness on the ground, the provision of equipment. So it's things like that that just can't be replicated overnight. So that is one reason why it's important to have the US involved. Also because, I mean, it's uncomfortable to say, but the nuclear component does matter. And the size and the diversity of the US nuclear component is something that the UK and France don't have to the same extent. So, there's that. There's the economic might, the ability to compel Russia by other means, the power of sanctions. But again, that US power, as great as it is, it's magnified when it's combined with the UK and the European Union and like-minded allies across the globe. So the US is powerful, but it would be even more powerful, as it always has been, when it's operating alongside allies and partners.
And that brings us back to NATO, where we started, I think, today. And on the way to NATO, Greenland. Is there a danger, do you really think, of an invasion of Greenland by the US? And if so, to what end?
The talk is troubling, and the Kingdom of Denmark is very worried about it. As a small nation that has essentially been an extremely close ally of the U.S. For many years. It's not only rattling; it's sort of emotionally shocking, and they're finding themselves having to essentially rethink and revisit everything they've ever based their national security outlook on. Their whole strategic approach has to be changed. So while I think military invasion is unlikely, I do worry about the potential to exploit some of the discontent in Greenland around not having independence at this moment in time. And the US willingness and ability to try to offer a good deal for Greenlanders. I think we should be very wary of that. You really don't need to look any further than other US territories and protectorates, whether it's Palau or Puerto Rico, to see how we treat people. I think the Greenlanders have a pretty good deal out of the Kingdom of Denmark. They're treated, not way back in the past, but currently treated with respect. They have access to excellent health care, schools, job prospects, respect for their cultures. So, I think for small states in this rough disruptive world, it really doesn't work to be a nation of 50,000 on your own up against not just the United States, but Russia, China, you name it.
Absolutely. And it's worth telling our listeners that at certain points, the US had as much as 15,000 troops in Greenland, and they were very welcomed there. They're now down to 1,500, but that's a US choice. Nobody forced them to withdraw troops.
Yes, and I was in the Pentagon when those decisions to draw down the US forces on Greenland were made. And we had many calls and many conversations with the Greenlanders and the Danes about not doing that. But the US, particularly the US Air Force, was very insistent that there were other priorities. So if there's a security deficit there, number one, it's the fault of the US and not the Kingdom of Denmark. And number two, there's a way to rectify that within the context of bilateral relationships, such as the one with Denmark, but also the multinational relationship with NATO.
Absolutely. NATO is basically, as I read yesterday in an interview, NATO is it offers you the defense that you need already. And if what you want is the minerals, then buy them. That's what you do. You trade, you don't just take them. Because that is, sort of, that's not going back to pre-world order. That's going back to somewhere in the 16th century, just going in and taking somebody else's resources in one way or another. So I think that's really dangerous. But you could end up with a situation of, if that does happen, if the US does take Greenland, then you've suddenly got a weird situation by which one NATO ally is attacking another NATO ally. So what happens to NATO?
Well, that would be unprecedented. We've had tensions within the alliance before. We have quite tense conversations sometimes between Greece and Turkey when there are air incursions. Spain and others have had difficult governments in the past. The Hungarians aren't always the easiest ally sometimes, particularly with regard to Ukraine assistance. So I think you'd be surprised what NATO can weather and what consensus and conversation can get you through. But certainly we'd be in uncharted territory, and that is really not in the US interest, and would set a terrible precedent globally.
Oh, I think it would be appalling, but it does leave a very interesting conundrum, which is, if one NATO ally attacks another NATO ally, does the attack NATO ally get to call Article 5?
Well, the attack NATO ally can always call Article 5, but it requires unanimity to then carry that forward. So you can play that scenario out, and it seems then more likely that if there were such an unlikely military invasion of Ukraine by the US, that the response would have to probably be outside the NATO context. So I think that's why Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, said, if that happens, everything stops. NATO is over, and we're in a much different world.
I suspect we're in a much different world in any case, but hopefully not as different as that.
Yes, there are degrees of terrible.
Rachel Ellehuus, thank you so much for that wonderful conversation. That's a wrap on this episode of Women Leaders. Keep listening to our conversations and support us with a subscription on your podcast platform. Leave us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, add to the conversation with your comments. In addition, help support our podcast and spread the happy word of this episode to friends, colleagues, enemies, family, and anyone you think would like it. We're on all media, so reach out on Instagram as @women_leaders_podcast, and on ELN Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All information and links mentioned in the episode can be found in the notes. I'm Ilana Beitel, together with my friend and producer Florence Ferrando, and we will be back very soon with another great conversation.